So I think we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to this session on healthcare design methods. I'm John Clarkson. I'm a professor of engineering design at the University of Cambridge, and a long-standing interest in how we take engineering thinking and systems thinking into the world of healthcare. So it's a real pleasure, privilege to be sharing this session on healthcare design methods in a very different format than we're normally used to. So most of you can't see each other, and we can't see most of you, and that's quite deliberate. So the people you can see, the presenters, most of the presenters up at the front here, but when it comes to questions later, there may be an opportunity for one or two of you to enter onto the stage so we can see you and you can ask your questions. But I'll ask you as we go through to record in the chat any questions you have of the presentations as they go through. So what I'm going to do is to give a brief description of the bios of the four main authors, and then we're going to hear the four presentations, and then we're going to go into an interactive discussion session after that. So just a summary of the bios of each of the four papers. So we have Kiyomi Yoshioka, who's been is associate professor at the Department of Design in Maier University. Her research areas or interests are in sensibility design, medical and welfare design, and the implementation of art and design workshops. And she's a member of various Japanese societies, including that for Universal Design and the Society of Integrative Medicine. And she'll be presenting virtually a paper on the development and clinical study of a projection images program to encourage arm movements from rehabilitation. Unfortunately, she's not going to be with us this morning, but we'll hear her presentation. And then we have Alix Feldman from DTU, Danish Technical University, with research interests in the areas of psychology, cognition, and healthcare systems, with particular focus on hearing and cognitive healthcare systems. And she's going to present on From Evidence to Implementation, how systems design can foresee complex healthcare interventions. Then we have Alexander Komashie, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Cambridge. He's a senior research associate in our healthcare systems team and a postdoctoral fellow of the Health Improvement Studies Institute, this institute in Cambridge, and a particular expertise and interest in systems approach to healthcare improvement and in the modeling and simulation of healthcare delivery systems. And Alix is going to talk about requirements for diagramming in the design of mental health delivery services. And finally, we have Leila Aflatoony, who's associate or assistant professor in the School of Industrial Design at Georgia Tech, particular interest in the areas in interaction design, human-computer interaction design, user experience design. And she's an HCI researcher, employs design approaches, methods, emerging technologies to address critical challenges in areas such as healthcare and education. And she's going to talk about CODEA, a framework for co-designing assistive technologies with occupational therapists, industrial designers, and end users with mobility impairments. So as we go to the presentations, I just ask that everybody would mute their mics during this phase so we can hear clearly all the presentations being made. And I'll come back to you when we've heard all four presentations. Thank you.
I'm Kiyomi Yoshioka of Maier University in Japan. I will present development and clinical study of a projection images program to encourage arm movement for rehabilitation. Sustaining patient motivation to perform simple or repetitive exercises is a problem in rehabilitation aimed at the recovery of physical function. In this research, to encourage patients to perform their rehabilitation exercises, we developed a device of an art program that connects rehabilitation exercises with the creation of art. It reflects the quality and level of rehabilitation exercise achieved in the outcome of the resulting artwork in projection images as feedback. This is a program called Let's Keep Wiping to Draw Pictures, focusing on upper limbs rehabilitation exercises. In the program, projected images are changed interactively according to the rehabilitation movement of flexing and extending the upper limbs, reflecting the achievement levels of exercise, amount, and quality of movement in the resulting artwork. in terms of differences in the image can improve the patient motivation toward rehabilitation. Here is a video of the Let's Keep Wiping to Draw Pictures program. The quality of the movement are reflected in these paintings as pixel, color, and drawing method. The program also involves a creative element. After the end of the rehabilitation exercises, the graphic image created in relation to the levels of exercise amount and quality of movement achieved by the patient can be printed out on a postcard paper and brought back as a result of the exercises performed. A clinical experiment using the program was conducted on 36 inpatients in a recovery phase rehabilitation hospital. Here is the method. We evaluated the patient satisfaction and expectation levels in working on rehabilitation on a 7-point scale. In addition, a graphic image reflecting the level of rehabilitation movement achieved by each patient was printed out on a postcard. After the 10th rehabilitation session, a questionnaire survey was conducted on postcard. Here is the result. When rehabilitation exercises were performed with the program, the level of satisfaction increased after exercising in both the first and 10th sessions. This graph is the level of expectation. We expect that the use of the program will encourage patients to actively engage in simple and repetitive rehabilitation exercises over a long period of time. In a questionnaire survey regarding the postcard, many patients answered that the postcard led to enjoyment and satisfaction in working on rehabilitation. In conclusion, we have developed the Let's Keep Wiping to Draw Pictures program, which is used for exercises involving flexion and extension of the upper limbs. The program allows patients to work on rehabilitation while confirming the quality of movement and the exercise amount through the projected graphic image. From the result of the clinical experiment, the program can be used in exercises of the upper limbs to maintain patient motivation toward rehabilitation and thereby promote the recovery of physical function. Thank you.
I'm Alix Feldman, a PhD student at D225 in Engineering Systems Design, and I've written this paper together with François Patou and Anja Maier. An aging population, a changing support ratio, and new technology are all changing the face of global healthcare. This means people are living longer, there's a faster pace of innovation and technological development, but it also means that there's a need for research that can help integrate these developments into routine clinical practice. In this paper, we look at what we need to consider when we design research that leads to the development and the effective implementation of these interventions. We're looking at how we can use theory-building research in order to effectively create patient-oriented and population-based interventions. We advocate for a system design-based approach, and we aim to address these outcomes using iterative design and evaluation strategies that can meet stakeholder needs early in the development process. As new knowledge is created at increasing speed, how can we streamline this evidence into clinical practice? It's been estimated that just 14% of research disseminated passively becomes incorporated into everyday practice. This can be known as the knowing-doing gap, a concept widely used in organizational management. It's explained by evidence that gets lost in translation and isn't harnessed and explored as part of a future intervention. By optimizing early clinical endpoints, it can help us better understand the coupling between interrelated variables. It can help us gain valuable experience and feedback, and it can anticipate useful collaborations between various clinical domains. Here we present our model for designing research with the aim of effective adoption of complex healthcare interventions. It begins with the formulation of a fundamental clinical question and explorative clinical research. As soon as one can foresee with some level of confidence the formulation of a future intervention, it becomes relevant to consider and to test and prototype how it could be implemented. This is where the traditional barrier lies. Even if an intervention is tested within a standard clinical research framework, more work is needed to ensure that it can function efficiently in a real-world environment. Here, we advocate for the implementation effectiveness hybrid design, an approach presented by Kern and colleagues, where an intervention is tested simultaneously with an implementation strategy. These rarely share the same outcome measures. Classic implementation addresses the adoption or the uptake of interventions by healthcare providers and uses outcome measures like behavioral change and adoption rates, whereas clinical research tends to rely on internal validity and more direct symptom-focused outcome measures. Using a hybrid design can help break down the traditional barrier, identify potential interactions between the intervention and the environment, and it can provide information that researchers can take forward to make strategic decisions earlier in the process. This becomes even more relevant when emerging research falls outside of the current discipline's common practice. One example is the case of cognitive healthcare, where recent research has demonstrated an association between hearing loss, dementia, and a decline in cognition. The recently updated Lancet Commission report has stated that hearing loss counts for 8% of the variance for the development of dementia at midlife, and it makes it one of the strongest potentially modifiable risk factors. Here, we could consider a complex healthcare intervention that's rooted in audiology and hearing care in an attempt to limit the progression of cognitive decline, even if causality is difficult to infer. This would mean considering the current attitudes and beliefs across the cognitive and hearing care organizational environments. For example, how often are patients who present with cognitive difficulties tested for questions about their hearing? Alternatively, are hearing care practitioners aware or interested about their patients' cognitive health? Including these stakeholders at the earliest stages, such as nurses, clinicians, audiologists, and neuropsychologists, may ensure that those who can implement the change are well-versed in the intervention. This could help improve diagnosis, improve quality of life, and it could identify avenues for targeted care at different stages of the patient journey. In summary, this paper argues that incorporation of design is fruitful from the earliest stages of conceptualizing and planning clinical research. By anticipating the later development and implementation of interventions, it may reduce the amount of clinical research that lays dormant in guidelines, journals, and educational materials. By approaching research design in a way that accounts for the various interacting components, we can identify avenues for targeted care at different stages of the patient journey, and we can bring our research closer to the overall goal, which is providing more valuable health outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to speak briefly about our work on the requirements for diagramming in the design of mental health delivery services. This work is presented within the context of a systems approach. And by that, I mean an approach to improvement that takes account of 4 key perspectives: people, systems, design, and risk. In talking about systems mapping or diagrammatic representation, our particular interest is in the systems perspective, where we want to understand the nature of the delivery service as a system, what are the key components, and how do we describe these components and their interrelationships to inform improvement efforts. The method is generally qualitative, involving workshops and interviews, and using a range of diagrams, as you can see in these pictures, which were presented to the participants. In addition to capturing their stories and experiences, these diagrams or maps help to capture their perceptions and views that reveal what was good and what was not so good about these maps. This is the result of the thematic analysis that we conducted on the transcript from the workshop and interviews. There were 4 themes: clear logical flow, key taking account of patient experience, highlighting system goals, and taking account of the wider system. Clear logical flow had other factors that were highlighted in the data, as you can see. These themes represent a set of high-level requirements for a diagrammatic representation in mental health. We wanted to frame these themes in a way that may be used to assess diagrammatic representations. We thought of an option. We thought an option might be the use of a matrix framework. You might think of a type 1 diagram as one that has a clear logical flow, but nothing else. And that could be a good quality diagram or map, but not very relevant. You might think of a type 2 diagram or map as having a clear logical flow and taking account of a wider system. Again, this might be considered a high quality diagram, but still with low relevance to the context. Or you might think of a type 3 diagram or map with clear logical flow, taking account of a wider system and also highlighting system goals. So this may be a high quality diagram and moderate relevance. And a type 4 diagram is one that may take account of everything, including taking account of patient experience as well. Clearly, this will not be a complete framework. Further work is required to fully develop this framework. In conclusion, we said that we identified 4 key requirements for diagrammatic representation in mental health and suggest a potential framework for assessing diagrams in the context of mental health and possibly in other parts of healthcare as well. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Leila Aflatoony and I collaborated on this research project with my colleague Susan Lee. We proposed a framework on how to co-design assistive technologies in interdisciplinary teams consist of occupational therapists, designers, and end users with mobility impairment. I'd like to start this presentation by providing a little bit of background about the needs behind this research. The complex nature of assistive technologies and individuals' physical impairments necessitate expertise beyond that possessed by designers or OTs. So developing assistive technology solutions should be an interdisciplinary process, although this is easier said than done. So this process is in need of an organized framework to facilitate the interdisciplinary collaboration. In order to understand how to structure the collaboration, we need to first look at the range of current approaches in developing assistive technology solutions. So our research question explored how can OTs, designers, and users' knowledge be shared and communicated within the interdisciplinary team, and what means, media, and methods can be utilized to facilitate transfer and replicate skills and knowledge in co-designing assistive technology. To answer our research questions, we conducted 4 different participatory workshops, which represent a range of ways in which OTs, designers, and end users can approach AT solution development. The workshops moved from replicating the most common traditional method of AT provision in OT practice to more experimental methods that involve industrial designers. These were followed by debrief interviews with each group separately. The co-design workshop revealed how knowledge and skills from OTs, designers, and end user can be shared and how tools, methods, and materials can be used to support their collaboration. In general, our findings acknowledge the need for interdisciplinary collaboration in designing complex AT devices by revealing the advantages of co-design, roles, and qualities of participation, as well as similarities and differences between OTs and designers' practice. More specifically, we found that OTs can explore and are creative, but benefit from guidance, demonstration, and designers to visualize their ideas. On the other hand, designers' technical understanding of human factors and ergonomics take on new meaning with OTs' clinical examinations. This process enabled designers to understand the true need of end users with physical impairments. Additionally, end user involvement enabled her to be aware of her own health condition and be actively engaged in AT design processes. Also, it was interesting to see the overlaps between OTs and designers' processes, as we summarized here. In the first step, which is equivalent of empathizing design thinking, OTs meet the client to learn about their needs, such as health status, experiences, and activities. Then OTs identify performance barriers, which is equivalent of defining design thinking, such as muscle fatigue or mobility issues. In the third stage, which is equivalent of ideating design thinking, OTs explore the best solution direction. Then they introduce off-the-shelf assistive technologies available in the market, which is equivalent of prototyping design thinking. Finally, OTs document the effects of assistive technologies based on clients' input, which is equivalent of test phase in design thinking. Based on lessons learned from this study, we propose a framework that integrates key activities, strategies, and methods that capitalize on the strengths of all approaches explored. Having a facilitator leader is helpful to maximize productivity while allowing full participation of all members involved. So we suggest that OTs take a lead on clinical exploration and problem identification, and designers take a lead on exploring, developing, and evaluating assistive technology solutions. Future work should include validating and refining this framework by involving additional end users, as well as investigating strategies to overcome current barriers that limit effective collaboration. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all our participants for their support and participation in this research. Also, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for help in playing those presentations. So we've got a wide sweep of different things there that are of great interest. And as yet, I'm puzzled because I can see who's in the room and there's some amazing people out there, but very few questions. So the challenge is for you to feed us some good questions, please, so we can have a decent discussion around healthcare design methods. And I know who you are, so I know what I'm expecting. But in the meantime, I'm going to pick on Dr. Komashie, since I know him so well. Alix, how many maps do we need? You're muted, Alix.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, John. I think that is a very important question. And I don't think I know the number yet, but I think we do need multiple perspectives. In fact, that is part of my interest, because I don't think that from what we're talking about in healthcare, being able to describe a delivery system can be done with only one diagram, and we need multiple perspectives. And what we don't have in healthcare right now is a way of viewing the healthcare service as a system. So you take, for example, UML, and UML has a way of viewing a software system. They know that you need a structural description, a behavior description, an architecture description. It gives you a set of perspectives that you can describe. But we don't have that in healthcare, which is part of my interest. So how do we actually understand what is a useful number of perspectives for fully describing a healthcare system? So I don't have the answer to the question, but I think we do need multiple perspectives, but I don't know the answer yet.
Thank you, Alix. I'm still waiting for these questions to flood in. And the panelists can ask questions of each other as well, if they would wish to do so. And Alix, the other Alix, with an I, clinicians are hugely skeptical of evidence. They only know of one sort of evidence. And so how do you, from a design perspective, bridge that gap into their world and their understanding of what good evidence looks like?
I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I've definitely been very interested in and sort of working, kind of grappling with at the moment. And I think that sort of represents the challenge that that model tries to look at, is to say, how can we use the evidence that we're generating and gathering together with the evidence that that's going on the clinical side, and to sort of work side by side with both pieces of evidence, so that at the stage when there is some form of clinically significant results showing the association between a concept, or showing that an intervention in a very controlled format and setting shows some results, that we also have the information as to what the stakeholders have been experiencing, whether they've tried maybe a new complex intervention and they found it easy to use or difficult to use, and especially involvement with stakeholders along the process can mean that when their version of evidence is ready in terms of regulation and protocol, that our feasibility and the prototypes and that development is just as far along at that time, is sort of the hope of bringing the hybrid design.
So do you find that you're almost appealing to their common sense, that you're providing them with a different form of evidence which you feel is compelling, and it may not be your RCT, but it's still something that should help them move in a different direction? Yeah,
hopefully. And I think it's sort of in a way, a process of working with the way in which evidence is recognized now, and possibly if it's RTCT at a sort of further stage, where for many healthcare areas that would be the standard. Once you hit a certain stage in that sort of process, from the ideal outcomes to the initial sort of research question or clinical motivation, is that by the time it gets to a stage where it could be ready to say, yes, we think that this is something that we should run into an RCT, that we also have enough research on our end about what the landscape looks like, what the clinical pathway, how we could optimize that process, and whether the stakeholders involved have some experience or familiarity with the complex healthcare intervention at hand.
So there's some acknowledgement that you may be moving towards gathering the sort of evidence that is compelling for them eventually.
Yeah, and I guess a little bit of that is sort of working underneath the layer of what the sort of the regular structure is as it lives now. But it is, if we have a really strong idea based on research that we hold that something might be impactful down the line, that we make sure that we're doing that work and running those workshops and keeping stakeholders involved, so that when the clinical research does get to a stage where it's ready, that we're also ready.
That's really helpful.
With the design piece.
That's helpful, thank you. And we've got some questions coming from Manny for Leila. So when you work with engineering students together with design students, do you see limitations and boundaries in their perception, reception, and engagements with design and empathy in particular? It's a great question.
It is a great question. Thanks for asking that. I won't necessarily see it as limitation or boundaries. Any type of collaboration would be beneficial in terms of the outcome and the quality of assistive technologies, talking about this particular case. I would say what is critical is how each, how different expertise would collaborate, and how we find the best way, which was my goal here, how a framework can be used to, to facilitate that collaboration. I would say, yes, I would love to in future project involve engineer students or engineers, and not necessarily students, but because like in my research, the designers, some of them were still students, but doesn't matter. I mean, the level of expertise and skills are different. So in each of these fields, the most important thing is to find out how to best enable them to work. Because if you read the paper, I found some gaps in terms of the way they exchange their knowledge, even the understanding of material, and even their approach to design was fairly different. I could find overlaps between OT's process and designer's process, which was very interesting. So I would say there are a lot of overlaps, but we need to find a framework or a way to facilitate that process. That's the most important thing.
That's really interesting. Just picking up another question from Anja, which I think is very insightful, turning it the other way around and asking what sort of questions do the occupational therapist asks during that process of collaborative design? So what do you observe?
Yeah, so it is more about clinical examination, because what they do is, I don't know how much you're familiar with occupational therapists. The reason I really love to work with them is, as part of their practice, they do a lot of DIY, do it by yourself, tweaking of assistive technologies that we consider this as design, and this is a creative process for us as designers. And so they try to also help in terms of design, but of course because they're not coming from design background, right, and their process is more DIY and using Velcro and everyday material to tweak assistive technologies. Of course, the solution usually is not as successful as if designer introduced the same thing. But their knowledge was super helpful in terms of understanding the true need of the patient, the person with mobility impairment, because these expertise is completely outside of what industrial designers do. For example, they were like, okay, if you design this product, right? So it's not only about function and look and material, but for example, it will interrupt with the muscle movement, moving of the patient can't move her hand anymore in this direction for writing. So their knowledge is of anatomy and similar are super helpful, and industrial designers were super excited, I would say, to work with them. And they said it is great if we can work with them because there is no way we would understand the need to this degree. So that's why I see there is a huge, opportunity in collaborating, like people from different disciplines and with different expertise and background, but it's not quite easy. I should say it's not quite easy. That's why we need to have a clear framework of how these people can help the project. I would say if, for example, going back to Mani's question, if I had a chance to also invite engineers, right, I think the outcome would be even better and even more, even stronger.
So have you worked with the occupational therapists for long enough to see any change in their behavior or their interaction? Do they become more creative as they work with the designers?
That's a really interesting question, because with all these changes in terms of technologies, and especially with 3D printing, so I know that in OT conferences, they are more aware of this and they are more willing to work with, I would say, designers, or they're looking forward to see, for example, tools or interventions that enable them to, for example, work with these technologies such as 3D printing. In terms of changes, in terms of like, if I know, like the reason I would say back in 2014, I had also a chance to work with occupational therapists, and that's how, and there are many great researchers, of course, that are from great researchers all around the world on this topic of occupational therapists and creativity and how to empower them to design, because they're already trying to do it. And I would say I don't necessarily see changes, but I see that they know that they are looking forward to see tools or technologies or collaborations from us to enable them to basically do design themselves or with us. I don't know. So that is, some people, for example, suggest that we need and that is what I'm working on. We need a tool such as a CAD tool that is simple and intuitive enough for them to themselves, get some more advanced design done, Some others suggest that, for example, as I also saw that in this project, that, for example, they can benefit from simply working with designers because it's basically too much to do, right? There are many limitations, even talking about 3D printing. It's hard to start, and it needs specific expertise. So what is the best approach? I don't know, but that was a good question. So I think they still are very interested in tweaking assistive technologies themselves, because that's part of the need of their job. What they do is, like, they introduce these off-the-shelf products, and a patient come back to them and say, look, this doesn't work. And they start tweaking to help. And that is, again, the quality is, of course, it's low technology, and it's, they can perhaps use it for a long time because of the material they use. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you. So before I come to Anja's question to Alix, there's a question from Bahar on what are the challenges for designers concerning the rigid healthcare system? So the fact that healthcare generally is very conservative, almost reluctant to change. And that's almost a question for each of you. What is your view in your research about that rigidity and how it causes difficulty for designers? Who wants to go first?
I was wondering what is meant by rigidity, which I suspect means not willing to change, is what that's meant. And
I think that's the interpretation, Alix. Yes.
Yeah. So I think in that sense, it is a challenge. But I think from my personal perspective, it's a challenge that is worth taking on because there is a lot to gain. And I think given the nature of healthcare delivery and also the nature of the profession, that they're very highly skilled, highly focused people. And so sometimes it's not surprising that they're not willing. But I think having been involved for more than 10 years now in healthcare, I can see that there is a change. People have become more and more open to the reality that healthcare is more than medicine. There's so much to healthcare that it's not just about medication and the clinical treatment. So I've been greatly encouraged by what I see changing in healthcare. I think as we persist and being part of the debate, the conversation going on, I think things are changing. So I don't think it is as rigid now as I first got in 10 years ago. So I think there's hope there, and I think it's worth being part of.
That's a nice optimistic view, Alix. So what about Alix?
Yeah, I think especially sort of similar to what you'd said about the sort of not having worked in this sector in this way for quite as long. But in regards to the rigid healthcare system, I think it's also about sort of the familiarity. A lot of it has to do with the perspectives when it comes to research and what's considered research that belongs in this sphere and that is valid for influencing change. And it's sort of a valid call to action to incite more research and more interest into an area. And I think the way I see it, especially with my paper's perspective, is to sort of try and work with the system the way it is. A lot of the rigidity is very much inherent in the system itself. And while, like Alexander said, I do think things are changing, it will be a long time before the change results in us being able to jump in the way that I think I'd really like to. And I can say that for now, I think at least I see it as my task to very much figure out how things are working on the ground and exactly what the constraints or the rigid system is in a specific clinical area, and then to figure out how we can work around it.
That's interesting. I think that relates partly to what Mani's come back talking about here, is that technicians are often a way in for that discussion. The problem solvers within the hospitals are often your friends. They're the ones who have that open mindset. So that's useful. Leila, do you have anything else to add to that question about the rigidity of healthcare?
Not really. I mean, it's.
That's fine. So you can stop this thing, because I want to put Alexander on the spot again, because there's a great question there from Anja. So provided, what does it say? Provided system overview is elicited, provided, easier said than done. I agree with that, through a diagram. What are the actions you might like to trigger, and actions by who? There's more than one question there, Alix.
Yes, I think that's a really good question. It's not an easy question. And I think, I mean, it's good that you've qualified it, it's easier said. But my experience with thinking about diagrams and trying to do diagramming for a few years now, I think what I find really important, that diagrams do or can do many different things. And I think how you use diagrams will depend on the specific context or purpose. And personally, I think that assessing diagrams based on their purpose is really important, because you can only tell whether this is a good or bad diagram if I know why you put that diagram together. So I think the diagram should have a purpose that is supposed to be fulfilled. It could be just to communicate aspects of the system. And I think in terms of the actions you take when you have a description of the system, my question would be that, does the diagram help in engendering shared understanding within the stakeholders involved in the delivery? And I'm thinking about healthcare improvement, where you have a team delivering improvements of some sort within healthcare. So the goal of the diagram, it can be to really help the team to have a shared understanding. Because I have found that in some cases, we can be talking about improvement in the same system, whilst we have different mental models of the system that we're trying to improve. And I think having a description of the system in the form of diagram is a way of helping us all develop a common understanding of what we're trying to do. And then there is a collective choice we have to make, or decision to make, as to what happens next, which I think is a question about what the diagram is a part of. So as I said, that what we're talking about is in the context of the systems approach. So the diagram is just one component of a whole range of tools that we use. So I think there is not a simple answer to that, but I think the context within which the diagram is being used will really determine what actions happens once we have a description of the system.
But is it the diagram or the process of diagramming that's more important here?
Yeah, so I think that again is an important point, because it's not just the diagram as a product in itself. And I think the process of putting that together, asking questions, is really important. And again, for the stakeholders, for some people, there's the process of putting the diagrams together has even more value than the diagram itself. And so in some cases, by the time you have produced the diagram, you have achieved quite a high proportion of the goal that you want in terms of helping people to understand what is going on and who is involved and what can go wrong. So I think the diagram is a process of revealing these really important issues that can, in fact, in some cases, cause the failure of a project. So I think, as John said, it's both the process and the product.
So I wanted to Alix to ask Alex her question.
Yeah, I can definitely do that instead of reading it off the screen. I had a question about what the differences were, the major differences between the diagram preferences between the service users and the staff. I imagine there would have been quite broad.
Yeah, so I didn't really separate the data, but obviously I saw the differences. And so I think that the staff were more, they had more comments to provide on the systems aspects. So they would say that, well, this description doesn't include what I do with prescription, or what I do when I have a therapy session, or so. They were more concerned with what is missing from, which is the system, the scope of the diagram, whilst the patients, and especially in mental health, the reaction was more, well, this doesn't capture how I feel or my experience. So it's quite an interesting balance, trying to say, do you have a diagram to satisfy the patient's needs, or do you have one for, which I think comes back to the question I'm quite interested at, how do we define a useful set of ways for describing healthcare delivery systems, which I think is really important, because you can describe so many different things. But what would be the most useful thing for a given context? Is it the behavior of patients or the patient flow, or information flow, or what are the different things? So I think at the moment, I haven't come across a framework that helps us know how to describe the complexity in that way. And I'm quite interested in that. That's what I want to find out.
Yeah, I think that's extremely interesting, because I find often when you talk about patient experience journeys or system journeys, they're often structured amongst almost exclusively a patient experience or almost exclusively a practitioner or clinician workflow almost. Yeah. And it's interesting to, I guess, explore whether there is value in putting those directly together, or whether there is an adapted version for both sides that includes a bit more of each other's experience.
Yeah, I think what I was really interested in this work is to be able to, just like the UML or SysML. So UML has this word of the description has to capture the structure of the software system, the behavior, the use case, and the architecture. And that's really, so you have a range of diagrams that allows you to describe all these perspectives, and all of that together form one system. Similarly, in SysML, you have they put more emphasis on requirements diagramming. That's really important. You have the structure, the requirements diagramming, and then you have the behavior as well. So when it comes to healthcare, I want to understand can we have a set of ways of viewing the healthcare, so I can say, for example, that to describe the system, I want to know the pathway, and then the key components or the stakeholders, or what are the range of things that I think we can say that within that you can have a range of diagrams which you can draw on each time to provide this complete set of maps to describe the system.
So, Joss, you have posted a question, which to me is quite complicated. I'm wondering if you could request to put your video and sound on, and we can let you on the stage to ask the question of Alix. I don't know whether that's possible when you know where the buttons are, whether Tanika can help us with this. Ah, where has it gone? Is there a button we need to press to let you on?
I allowed.
If you're a moderator, you should. He must be on his way.
I allowed him to speak, but I'm not sure what happened. It's on the right.
I mean, I can try corner. And I can start addressing it.
If you could interpret the question, that would be great.
Yeah, I think I can. I mean, it sort of almost seems like there's two parts of it, because of course, things that the patient values are important in the evaluation and development of these interventions, but of course they can be different, and they always will be in practice compared to the clinical trial phase, and investigator bias could definitely be one of them. And another is that, of course, when you are trialing something, people are very motivated to take part and to try this out, and it's not necessarily something that's being administered on a large scale, so you don't get as much as you try. You don't often get the same variety of experiences and responses. I think the insights from the trial phase are so relevant in a way, because of course they help you to re-establish new prototypes, to change the intervention, to alter it slightly if needed. And I think sort of the best case is if you're able to do both at the same time, to put things into practice while you're also running these sort of trial and feasibility studies, then you can kind of create a loop where you are adjusting things based on the experience you have, the experience with patients, and that you can use that to improve the intervention itself and then sort of bring it back. So it feels that then by the time you're able to do something on a really controlled and large scale, that you've had enough experience with a few or a smaller number of patients that you're able to get valuable feedback from. And a lot of that would definitely be the values, which isn't normally in all sort of clinical research projects as an established measure.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And Joss, if you have any more you want to ask, then please come back through the thread. Leila, I had a question for you. I'm really interested in assistive technology as to whether we end up designing a general product to be adjusted for fit for different individuals, or whether the view is that we might be moving potentially to more individualized solutions. And if so, what are the economics or practicalities of that?
That's a great question. I would say, and that is something that we would benefit definitely from a clinician, right? A person who knows more about patients and their their limitation, but physical and body limitation, because I believe depending on the type of ability and limitation, we may need to custom design assistive technologies. And that's a need. We have all these off-the-shelf solutions, assistive technologies that many people can buy and use them, right? But the problem is the lack of fit because of this unique, our body is quite complex, right? So I had a pleasure to work in a project years back with this patient that unfortunately he was in an accident, and the nerve system is quite complex, and the problem he had was quite unique because of the type of limitation it caused to him. And so anyways, there was no assistive technology that could help him at that point. So and so there was a need to develop a unique and custom design assistive technology. So I would say again, this is something that is a great question that we can ask clinicians, and especially occupational therapists. But based on what I observed, there is this huge need in terms of tweaking and adapting and repurposing off-the-shelf solutions to adjust it enough to fit the need of specific patient.
That's an important point, isn't it? And it's a common message, I think, in all the presentations today, is that closeness of working with the clinicians and the care providers. It's fundamental to this. It's all well and good us having our own thoughts about design process or how designers or engineers think. Without that insight and conversations with the clinicians, nothing moves.
No.
Yeah.
No, we can't make decision by ourselves.
I actually have
Alix, please.
a question on that, and it's basically more of just I'm curious, because of all the hands-on work that you've done in your research, did you see examples of OTs that had kind of been going rogue and doing these types of adaptations already?
Yeah. So they do this a lot, and in fact, there is a book on that is a great book on the collection of assistive technologies that they do on everyday basis, and that is part. They never. I should say that I like that you use also adaptation, because that's what OTs does. They do. They don't start from scratch the way we do design, right? And they usually take one off the shelf or an existing solution and try to tweak it. And that is part of the process. Did I answer your question?
I think so, yeah. Is it ever the case, I guess, and I think maybe that's the work with designers, is that if they find themselves regularly taking off-the-shelf solutions that are bought for the healthcare purposes, often similar to what they're trying to use them for, but they find themselves tweaking them to their needs so often, does that end up feeding back into the design of the product itself and then the creation of a new product that's more helpful to them?
Absolutely. Again, that's the need, right? So for they even have their own tools. So, for example, one of them had this heat gun to bend existing products, and they have their own approach. It's really interesting, their creative process. But the reason I'm interested in this type of project is there is a real need out there, and they really try to help patients, because that's no one else can help them. And sometimes families and caregivers and patients themselves, I mean people with disabilities, they also try to tweak products and assistive technologies, but also everyday products. Sometimes they try to tweak and adapt what they can find in the market, not necessarily as assistive technology, but everyday products. So yeah.
So as we come to the end of this session, I've got a challenge for the three presenters here in one short sentence to summarize what they learned in their paper, what they've shown in their paper. And in one more short sentence, what is the one thing they would like to discover next, or what are they looking at next? So who wants to go first? So one short sentence saying what, just their paper in one sentence, and the second sentence, what happens next? It's all gone very quiet.
I can go.
You go first, Alexander.
Yeah, so I think for me, in one sentence, it's about identifying those requirements of representation diagramming within mental health. So that is what I think is the thing that comes out. I think in terms of the next steps, I am quite interested in understanding beyond mental health. And so is it possible to understand this for healthcare generally? And how do you go from that understanding of this requirements to an approach, to developing an approach that is specific for mapping or diagramming or representing healthcare systems?
Thanks, Alex. That's great. Who wants to go next?
I can go next.
Leila, you go.
Sure. So I think what was I think the paper was quite, there was a lot of different finding in there, but I think what stand out to me, at least in this crowd, all this finding, is that there is a need for collaboration among different expertise, and we just need a framework. We need to help them to do that. So my next study or studies would be, I'm focusing on finding ways to empower occupational therapists with design. And that there are many ways to do it. It can be, I don't know, a studio, a design studio that they can go there and get help from designers, and so they can design this together. Or we can design tools that are simple enough for them to be able to do more advanced design through 3D printing and more like fabrication technologies, etc. So anyways, in short, find ways or interventions to empower occupational therapists with design. That's the next.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, I think what I sort of felt that I learned or really put together in the process of the paper is lining out what sort of lies between a clinical motivation and a targeted outcome, or better said, maybe what lies behind addressing a targeted health outcome that's desired, and sort of how to bring it back from the earliest stages. And what I'm hoping to take from here is to actually sort of put it into practice, is to take the case project that I'm working on now and to find where in the spectrum it sits, and to really see it and play it forward on that model and move it forward as effectively as possible on that sort of steps towards the targeted health outcome, and hopefully towards the stage of a complex healthcare intervention.
That's great. Thank you. And it's been a privilege for me to be here listening to these presentations and the ones in the session Alex led earlier, to see this resurgence and increasing field of excellent papers in healthcare design within this conference, with the ISEG conferences as well. I think it is a fabulous step forward. So all of you know that we now have a special interest group in health systems design. I think that's a fantastic step for the Design Society to take, to encourage us all to keep doing work of this quality and of this interest and value. So thank you to all the presenters for the hard work you've put in, writing the papers, putting the presentations together, answering the questions. Thanks to the audience who's still with us for all your questions too, hugely appreciated. And Fanneke, thank you very much for your help in just keeping us on track and enabling the technology. I really appreciate that work behind the scenes as well. So thank you.
You're really welcome.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
So you can all run off to the social event now and experience another form of software technology, and enjoy yourselves. Hope you have a great time out there.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.